In the peaceful and beautiful town of Piney Hill, the brutal murder of Jennifer Johnson sent shockwaves through the community. What once seemed like a serene suburban neighborhood was suddenly torn apart by a crime shrouded in lust and betrayal. This dark tale involved two couples, Daniel and Linda Garner, and Mark and Jennifer Johnson, whose intertwined lives were filled with drama that spiraled into obsession, deception, and murder. Daniel Garner, a well-known architect in social circles, was admired for his charm and his perfect marriage to Linda, a dedicated school teacher. On the other hand, Mark Johnson was a successful financial advisor married to Jennifer, a woman captivating for her beauty. These four weren't just close neighbors who often hosted BBQs together, they were also involved in a wife-swapping agreement that initially seemed thrilling and adventurous for all of them. But beneath this unconventional lifestyle, dangerous emotions brewed. Daniel developed an intense obsession with Jennifer. Linda, growing suspicious of her husband, watched as Jennifer, who became uncomfortable and wanted to end the arrangement, remained unaware of the fatal consequences her decision would bring. From the outside, Daniel and Linda's decade-long marriage appeared happy and stable. Their home on Maple Street was Linda's pride, with its meticulously kept garden. Meanwhile, Mark and Jennifer had moved to Piney Hill 5 years earlier and quickly became the Garners' closest friends. Jennifer's charm made her the star of the neighborhood, while Mark was known for being a friendly, party-loving guy. The wife-swapping began after a dinner party at the Garners. A casual conversation fueled by wine led to a discussion about open relationships. Surprised? Sure, but more curious than shocked. Within weeks, an agreement was made with rules to ensure that their marriages remained intact. At first, things went smoothly. Both couples seemed happier and their social lives carried on as usual. But over time, subtle changes began to appear, especially in Daniel. He started finding more excuses to see Jennifer, even without the others knowing. His attraction deepened, and he became fixated on her to the point where his passion for his architecture projects started to feel meaningless. Linda began to notice something was off with her husband. Initially, she chalked it up to their new lifestyle, but over time she realized that Daniel's obsession with Jennifer had gone beyond their agreement. One day, Linda approached them, her voice trembling as she called out Daniel's name. Seeing Linda seemed to snap Daniel out of his rage. He turned to her, his expression a mix of confusion and relief. Meanwhile, Jennifer seized the moment to escape, determined to distance herself from Daniel as far as possible. Now alone with her husband, Linda tried to calm him, assuring him they could figure things out. But deep down, she knew their lives had changed forever. The affair had reached its breaking point, and Jennifer's decision to end the arrangement had triggered a series of events that couldn't be undone. As the tension in the garden subsided, the effects of Daniel's obsession and Linda's involvement became evident, leading to a violent and tragic conclusion. The confrontation left Daniel in a state of turmoil. Jennifer's firm rejection and Linda's unexpected arrival shattered him. That night, Daniel returned home filled with anger, betrayal, and despair. Linda, sensing the storm brewing inside her husband, tried to soothe him, but Daniel was inconsolable. Over the next few days, Daniel's behavior became increasingly erratic. He oscillated between explosive rage and deep despair. He stopped going to work, spending his days obsessing over Jennifer's rejection and the injustice he felt. Linda, growing more frightened and frustrated, knew something had to be done, but she was unprepared for the drastic turn of events that was about to unfold. Meanwhile, Jennifer was determined to move on. She avoided contact with Daniel, focusing on her work and her relationship with Mark. She hadn't told her husband the full extent of Daniel's obsession, fearing his reaction and the potential fallout. She hoped that cutting ties would finally make Daniel accept reality and leave her alone. One night, Jennifer came home from work to find Daniel waiting for her outside her house. Her heart sank as she braced for another confrontation. Cautiously, she approached him, her voice firm but calm, asking Daniel to leave. But Daniel, with a desperate look in his eyes, pleaded for one last chance to explain himself. Jennifer, knowing the conversation would be futile, tried to walk past him, but Daniel grabbed her arm. His grip was strong and painful, and Jennifer could see the madness in his eyes. She struggled to break free, screaming, which caught the attention of a neighbor. Seeing people come out, Daniel let go of Jennifer and fled. Shaken and terrified, Jennifer thanked the neighbor before rushing inside her house. She immediately called Linda, hoping to find a solution without involving the police. Hearing the fear in Jennifer's voice, Linda agreed to meet the next day to figure out how to handle Daniel's increasingly unstable behavior. The next day, Linda met Jennifer at a local cafe. Jennifer looked exhausted and tense, recounting the previous night's events and her growing fear for her safety. Linda listened intently, her mind racing for solutions. She promised to talk to Daniel and make sure he understood that their relationship was over. After that meeting, Linda returned home to find Daniel in a restless state. She immediately confronted him about the incident with Jennifer, her voice a mix of anger and concern. Feeling cornered, Daniel exploded, accusing Linda of siding with Jennifer and betraying him. The argument escalated, and a frightened Linda eventually retreated to their bedroom. That night, Daniel's mind grew darker. He couldn't accept that Jennifer had rejected him, and that even his own wife was turning against him. In his twisted thoughts, he believed the only way to end his suffering was to eliminate the source of his pain. Daniel decided that if he couldn't have Jennifer, no one could. On a cold and silent night, Daniel made his way to the Johnson residence. He knew Mark was out of town, leaving Jennifer alone. Calmly, he entered through a side window and crept into the bedroom where Jennifer slept peacefully. The sight of her resting only fueled his rage and desperation. Grabbing a kitchen knife, he approached her, his heart filled with a sickening blend of love and hatred. Jennifer awoke to see Daniel standing over her, the knife glinting in his hand. She tried to scream, but Daniel silenced her with a strong hand over her mouth. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, he stabbed Jennifer, silencing her forever. As her life faded away, Daniel stood there, his mind overwhelmed by conflicting emotions. After the murder, Daniel fled the scene, his hands covered in blood. He returned home, left only with confusion and devastation. Linda found Daniel trembling and incoherent and immediately realized what he had done. In a twisted sense of loyalty, Linda decided to help him cover up the crime. The life they had built, the secrets they shared, everything was on the line. Linda knew that if they wanted to survive, they had to act quickly and decisively. Driven by self-preservation, Linda took control. She led Daniel to the bathroom, telling him to strip off his clothes and wash off the blood. Her mind raced, knowing they had to erase any trace of evidence and protect their secret. While Daniel stood under the hot shower, the water turning pink at his feet, Linda gathered his bloody clothes and stuffed them into a plastic bag. She cleaned the floors Daniel had walked on, making sure no trace of blood was left behind. Once Daniel was clean, she sat him down and forced him to recount the details of the night, even though he was emotionally shattered. His voice shaking, Daniel managed to tell her everything. Linda then devised a plan. They needed an alibi and had to get rid of any evidence that could link them to the murder. Linda called a trusted friend, claiming Daniel had been with her all night, solidifying their alibi. Afterward, she drove to a secluded spot outside town and burned Daniel's bloody clothes and the murder weapon, hoping the fire would destroy any remaining evidence. The police soon questioned everyone in the neighborhood, including the Garners. Linda's carefully constructed alibi held up under scrutiny, and though Daniel seemed disturbed, he managed to avoid suspicion. The investigation hit a dead end without any concrete leads pointing their way. Even though they had evaded the authorities, the psychological toll of the murder weighed heavily on both Daniel and Linda. Daniel grew increasingly paranoid, convinced the police were closing in on him. He withdrew from friends and colleagues, trapped in a spiral of fear and regret. Linda, outwardly composed, also felt the strain of their dark secret. She became hyper-aware, watching every interaction for signs that anyone might suspect them. The weeks following Jennifer's murder blurred into a haze of tension and lies. Linda took on the role of stabilizer, managing Daniel's paranoia while maintaining their public facade. She kept close tabs on the news, relieved each day that no solid evidence had surfaced. But Linda knew that having an alibi wasn't enough. They needed to create a narrative that would divert attention away from Daniel. She suggested that Daniel act more visibly heartbroken over Jennifer's death, to align with the community's grief and deflect suspicion. At social gatherings, Daniel played the part of a grieving friend. He spoke of Jennifer with a mix of affection and sorrow, his eyes often welling up with tears. Mark, devastated and desperate for answers, appreciated Daniel's empathy, never suspecting his friend's involvement in his wife's death. However, Daniel's mental state continued to deteriorate. His guilt manifested in nightmares and hallucinations. He began drinking heavily, seeking temporary escape in alcohol. Linda, terrified that Daniel might confess in a drunken stupor, kept a close watch on him, often staying up late to make sure he didn't leave the house. One night, as Daniel sat slumped with a glass of whiskey in hand, he finally broke down. He confessed to Linda that he couldn't live with the guilt any longer and wanted to come clean. Linda panicked, trying to calm him down and keep them both from unraveling. She suggested they take a break, leave town for a while. They packed up and headed to a remote cabin in the mountains, hoping the change of scenery would help Daniel regain his composure. During their time in the cabin, Linda constantly emphasized the importance of keeping their secret. She trained Daniel on how to handle police interrogations and interact with the public, making sure he could respond without hesitation. Linda was relentless in her determination to protect their lifestyle and avoid prison at all costs. Upon returning to Pine Hill, the Garner family tried to resume life with a renewed spirit. Despite still being haunted by his actions, Daniel worked to appear more stable. Linda took charge of their relationships in the community, ensuring they remained under the radar of suspicion. However, cracks in their facade began to show. Friends and neighbors started noticing Daniel's increased drinking and his increasingly erratic behavior. Whispers about his potential involvement in Jennifer's death began to circulate. Linda, always vigilant, worked hard to silence those rumors. She knew time was running out. As the police investigation continued, new evidence began to surface, revealing inconsistencies in Daniel's alibi. The carefully constructed world they had built was on the brink of collapse, and the truth was inching closer to being revealed. Detective Mitchell interviewed the Garner family separately, taking note of any discrepancies in their stories. While Linda's alibi appeared solid and Daniel seemed consistent as a grieving friend, Mitchell's intuition told him there was something bigger going on. As time passed, more evidence emerged. Forensic analysis of Jennifer's phone records revealed a series of desperate texts from Daniel indicating his obsession with her. Mitchell then brought Daniel in for further questioning, pressing him about inconsistencies in his alibi and his relationship with Jennifer. Although Daniel tried to stick to the story Linda had taught him, his nervousness and evasive answers only heightened the detective's suspicions. The turning point came when a neighbor came forward with crucial information. They claimed to have seen Daniel's car parked near the Johnson home on the night of the murder, and recalled his strange behavior. This testimony, combined with forensic evidence in Daniel's unstable demeanor, was enough for the police to obtain a search warrant for the Garner home. During the search, the police uncovered remnants of burned clothing and traces of blood seeping into the floor, despite Linda's careful cleaning. This damning evidence, along with witness testimonies and phone records, clearly implicated Daniel. The net was tightening around the Garner family, and Linda realized that the world they had painstakingly built was about to come crashing down. She knew the only way to avoid a lengthy prison sentence was to devise a new plan that could divert attention away from them. As the police closed in, Linda and Daniel had to face the bitter reality the lies and deceit that once protected them were now threatening to destroy everything. As evidence against Daniel continued to pile up, Detective Mitchell was ready to make his move. He brought Daniel in for one more round of questioning, adopting a different approach. Mitchell laid out all the evidence they had gathered: phone records, witness testimonies, and forensic findings. Cornered and overwhelmed, Daniel began to crack under the pressure. Mitchell pushed on, suggesting that if Daniel confessed, he might receive a lighter sentence. Ultimately, Daniel could no longer bear the weight of guilt and the relentless questions. He confessed to killing Jennifer, detailing his obsession, the confrontation that ensued, and the moment he lost control. However, in his confession, Daniel also implicated Linda, revealing her role in covering up the crime. He explained how she had helped him clean the crime scene, dispose of evidence, and craft their alibi. Seeing the opportunity to get the full story, Mitchell brought Linda in for questioning. Initially, Linda denied any involvement, but as Mitchell laid out the evidence in Daniel's confession, she realized there was no way out. The web of lies she had carefully constructed was collapsing. She admitted to helping Daniel, explaining that she had done so out of misplaced loyalty and fear of losing everything. The trial of Daniel and Linda Garner captured the attention of Pine Hill and the surrounding areas. The courtroom was filled with reporters and curious onlookers eager to witness the conclusion of this tragic story. Daniel was charged with first-degree murder, while Linda faced charges as an accessory to murder and obstruction of justice. Both pleaded guilty to their respective charges. Daniel was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, while Linda, despite her involvement in the cover-up, received a lighter sentence due to her cooperation in the investigation and her previously clean record. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 10 years. Mark Johnson, who was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered life, found a bit of solace in the justice that was finally served, but he continued to mourn the loss of his beloved wife. After the trial, Pine Hill slowly returned to its routine, but the shadow of the tragedy lingered in every corner. Mark Johnson, though trying to move forward, felt lonely and empty. People around him often avoided him, unsure of how to approach a man who had lost so much in such a short time. Even amidst the support from friends and family, the grief and solitude always loomed. Meanwhile, Linda, behind bars, felt the strain of prison life. Although her sentence was lighter than Daniel's, each day felt like an endless torment. She constantly reflected on how everything had fallen apart so quickly. Guilt and regret haunted her. but the fear of losing the life she and Daniel had built kept her determined to endure. Daniel, serving his life sentence, gradually began to lose his sanity. The guilt over Jennifer's death and the destruction he caused continued to haunt him. There was no escape from his own thoughts, and nightmares tormented him every night. Time in prison only exacerbated his suffering, making it painfully clear that his life was now nothing more than a shadow of the life he once knew. Meanwhile, Detective Mitchell continued to receive accolades for his success in the case. Yet deep down he understood that while justice had been served, nothing could truly restore the lost lives. Jennifer was gone, and no punishment could heal the wounds endured by everyone involved. Nevertheless, he pressed on with his work, relentlessly pursuing the truth in a world rife with deception and lies. The Garner family case became a long-running topic of conversation in Pine Hill, serving as a tragic reminder of what can happen when lies and unchecked obsession spiral out of control. Townspeople whispered about how the couple had seemed so normal, so perfect on the outside, while a horrifying darkness lay hidden beneath. For Mark, life after Jennifer was a struggle to find meaning amid the devastation. Time passed, but the emotional scars remained open, never fully healing. Although he eventually found ways to move forward, the shadows of loss and the pain inflicted by Daniel and Linda never truly faded. This story serves as a reminder that no matter how hard we try to conceal our mistakes and sins, the truth always has a way of surfacing. Linda and Daniel attempted to escape the consequences of their actions, but ultimately the truth they sought to avoid ended up destroying them. Each day in that small town, people spoke, remembered, and learned from the mistakes of the Garner family. While life continued, the scars left by the tragedy lingered, reminding everyone that no lie can endure forever, and that every action carries inevitable consequences. As time went on, Pine Hill slowly returned to its usual pace, but the shadow of the Garner tragedy hung in the air. The town had witnessed the unraveling of a seemingly perfect family, and though people resumed their daily routines, they couldn't help but feel the weight of what had happened. It was as if an invisible mark had been left on the town, a subtle shift in how they viewed not only the Garner family but also each other. People became more cautious, more guarded, as if the tragedy had made them aware of the dark corners hidden in even the most familiar places. Mark Johnson, though surrounded by well-meaning friends and family, continued to grapple with his grief. He often found himself sitting in the empty living room, staring at old photographs of Jennifer, the memories of their life together both comforting and torturous. He'd try to remember the good times, but the overwhelming sense of loss always crept back in. Some days were better than others, but the void left by her absence was something he could never fully escape. Detective Mitchell, after closing the Garner case, moved on to other investigations, but this one stuck with him. It wasn't the most complex case he'd worked on, but the personal toll it took on everyone involved was something that lingered in his mind. He often thought about the moments that led up to Daniel's downfall, about how someone's life could spiral so far out of control without anyone noticing until it was too late. The case had left its mark on him too, a reminder that beneath every surface there could be unseen turmoil. For Linda Garner, prison life was a stark contrast to the world she once knew. The woman who had once prided herself on control now found herself in an environment where control was a distant memory. She spent her days replaying the events in her mind, wondering if there had been a point where things could have gone differently. Could she have stopped Daniel before it was too late? Could she have saved herself? These thoughts haunted her. But deep down she knew there was no undoing what had been done. Daniel, on the other hand, descended further into his own mental anguish. His life behind bars became a bleak existence. His obsession with Jennifer, the act of taking her life, and the aftermath of that fateful night played on repeat in his mind. As the days turned into years, Daniel became more withdrawn, unable to cope with the crushing weight of his guilt. He had lost everything: his freedom, his wife, and any hope for redemption. Pine Hill, now forever changed by the tragedy, tried to find a sense of normalcy. New families moved in, children grew up, and the seasons changed as they always did. But the town's collective memory of the Garner case was never too far from the surface. It was a story that would be passed down. A cautionary tale about the dangers of obsession, the price of lies, and the fragility of the lives we build. In the end, the tragedy of the Garner family served as a somber reminder to Pine Hill that appearances can be deceiving, and beneath the calm, quiet surface of life, there can be storms brewing, waiting to unravel everything in their path. Years passed, but the legacy of the Garner case continued to haunt Pine Hill. For some, it became a distant memory, a grim story whispered in hushed tones at dinner parties, or shared late at night among friends. For others, it remained a painful reminder of the town's darkest chapter, a piece of history they couldn't shake no matter how hard they tried to move on. Mark Johnson, after years of grappling with grief, finally found a way to build a new life, though it was far from what he had envisioned. He moved out of the house he once shared with Jennifer, unable to bear the constant reminder of her absence. A small cottage on the outskirts of town became his new sanctuary, a place where he could heal, slowly away from the ghosts of his past. He devoted his time to community projects, hoping to make a positive impact on others, perhaps to honor Jennifer's memory in a way that brought some form of light to his life again. Yet, even as he found moments of peace, the scars remained. Every now and then he would catch a glimpse of something, a flower Jennifer had loved, a song they used to dance to, and the sadness would wash over him all over again. But time, as it often does, softened the sharp edges of his pain. It didn't erase the hurt, but it dulled it just enough for him to keep going. Back in Pine Hill, the story of the Garners was no longer front-page news, but the town still carried an undercurrent of mistrust. People who had once been open and warm were now more guarded, their smiles more hesitant. Everyone remembered how a seemingly perfect couple had hidden such darkness beneath the surface. Some of the older residents would often murmur about how things were never quite the same after that. For Linda, prison life continued to strip away the last remnants of the woman she once was. She tried to adjust, but it was clear that the years inside had taken their toll. The once sharp, calculating woman now appeared worn and defeated. Her mind was constantly filled with thoughts of Daniel, the life they once had, and the choices that led them to this point. She no longer believed there was any hope of returning to the life they had built, nor did she feel any chance for redemption. Her actions had sealed her fate, and she knew it. Even when parole hearings began to approach, Linda couldn't bring herself to believe she deserved freedom. Daniel, too, was forever lost in the labyrinth of his own guilt and delusion. The years behind bars did little to bring him peace. If anything, they worsened his mental state. He had become a shell of the man he once was, withdrawn, haunted by nightmares, barely interacting with anyone. The other inmates and guards saw him as a broken man, someone whose spirit had been shattered long before he ever set foot in the prison. Daniel never spoke about the night he killed Jennifer again, but the weight of it never left him. It was etched in his very being, an inescapable burden that consumed what little was left of his sanity. As for Detective Mitchell, he continued his career, taking on more cases, some even more gruesome than the Garner case. But this one stayed with him, a reminder that justice, while necessary, could never fully heal the wounds caused by senseless tragedy. He had brought closure to the investigation, but there was no bringing back Jennifer or undoing the devastation her death had caused. Mitchell often found himself reflecting on the case during quiet moments, wondering if there was anything that could have prevented it. The job of a detective, after all, was not just to solve crimes, but to understand the people behind them, their motives, their fears, their regrets. In this case, Mitchell had come to realize that some people are simply trapped by their own darkness, and no amount of intervention can save them once they've crossed certain lines. Pine Hill eventually became a quieter town, but the caution remained. The residents, both old and new, learned to look a little closer, to pay attention to the small cracks that might indicate something more sinister lurking beneath the surface. The case of Linda and Daniel Garner became part of the town's folklore, a story to warn future generations about the dangers of unchecked obsession, secrets, and the illusion of perfection. In the end, the Garner case was a tragic example of how easily a seemingly perfect life could unravel. It was a reminder that beneath the facade of normalcy, people could be hiding turmoil, pain, and desires that, once unleashed, could destroy not only their own lives but also those around them. It was a warning to everyone in Pine Hill that sometimes, no matter how much you try to cover your tracks, the truth always finds a way to surface. And when it does, the consequences can be devastating. As time wore on, the town of Pine Hill continued to evolve, but the specter of the Garner case was never far from the town's consciousness. Every now and then, when someone new arrived in town, or the anniversary of Jennifer Johnson's death rolled around, the old stories would resurface. People would recount the chilling details with morbid fascination, speaking of Linda and Daniel as if they were characters in a grim novel, people who had seemingly lost themselves to a toxic mix of obsession, jealousy, and lies. Mark Johnson's life, though far from perfect, began to settle into a quieter rhythm. He still visited Jennifer's grave on important dates, laying fresh flowers and speaking quietly to her, even if no one was around to listen. His grief remained, but over time it became more bearable, a part of him, but not his entire being. He eventually remarried, though it took years for him to allow himself to open up to someone new. His second wife, a kind and understanding woman named Rachel, never pressured him to forget the past. Instead, she supported him, helping him navigate the complicated emotions that remained, always aware that Jennifer's memory would forever be a part of their relationship. Together, Mark and Rachel built a life that was simpler and more peaceful. Though the scars of the past never fully faded, Mark found solace in the small joys of everyday life. He became more involved in community work, started running a youth outreach program, and tried to give back to the town that had seen him through his darkest days. For him, it was a way to honor Jennifer's legacy, a way to ensure that her death wasn't in vain. Meanwhile, Detective Mitchell remained a steady presence in the world of law enforcement. Though he handled case after case, none seemed to affect him quite like the Garner case had. Occasionally, he would drive by the places connected to the story, the house where Jennifer had been killed, the quiet street where the Garners had lived. Those places had become landmarks of tragedy, forever tied to the violent unraveling of two lives. Mitchell, for all his success, never shook the feeling that the case had exposed something deeper about the human condition, about the fragile line between normalcy and madness. The Garner case had been a sobering reminder that no one is immune to the consequences of their darkest desires, and that even in a quiet town like Pine Hill, those desires could spiral into something catastrophic. Linda, serving out her sentence, lived each day in a grim state of acceptance. The reality of prison life had stripped her of the illusions she once clung to, the belief that she could control her destiny, that she could shield Daniel from the truth. As her release date inched closer, Linda realized that even if she were to regain her freedom, she would never truly be free. The weight of her actions and the part she played in the tragic events would follow her for the rest of her life. She had destroyed her own life in the process of trying to save it, and that was a reality she couldn't escape. Daniel, on the other hand, had long since given up any hope of redemption. The years of isolation and guilt had taken their toll, and by the time he reached the midpoint of his life sentence, he was a broken man. His once clear-eyed confidence had crumbled into a fog of regret and mental decline. He spoke less and less, retreating further into himself as the prison walls closed in around him. For Daniel, there was no future, only the endless reliving of the moment he lost control, and the shattered lives that resulted.